Now to Ukraine, and the country's nuclear chief is calling for a demilitarized zone around Europe's biggest nuclear power station at Zaporizhzhia, which has been under Russian occupation since the early weeks of the war. Kiev and Moscow have traded blame for recent shelling at the plant that caused damage and led to a reactor shutdown. The head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has warned that any attack on a nuclear power plant is suicidal. He wants access to the site for international inspectors. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has accused Russia of nuclear blackmail. In his latest video address, he called for international sanctions against Russia's nuclear industry.
We are actively informing the world about Russian nuclear blackmail, about the shelling and mining of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There are already appropriate reactions from the international community, but we need to speed up actions in response. Russia will not respect words or worries. New sanctions are needed against the terrorist state and the entire Russian nuclear industry for creating the threat of a nuclear disaster.
Our correspondent Matthias Böllinger is in Kiev. I asked him how dangerous the situation is and what's being done to ensure safety at that nuclear plant.
So there have been worries about this power plant since the very beginning of the war, since the Russians entered the territory. The fighting broke out there in March already, where people were worried that it might endanger their safety. And of course, these rocket attacks now are adding urgency to these worries. Russia has been using this power plant as a shield. They have stationed artillery and military equipment on the premises of this power plant, and they have also used it as I would say a means of psychological threat. They have said that one of the commanders has said that this power plant will either be Russian or it will be nobody's, effectively threatening to blow it up in the case Ukraine would try to seize the territory. This is, of course, again, a violation of all international norms. No fighting must take place near power plants, according to international law. But in this war, of course, we have seen many crimes or violations of international law. So the worries are high. It's not that the power plant will explode if one shell hits the reactors. The reactors are pretty sturdy, and they are designed to withstand a certain amount of damage. But there are many weak spots in power plants, and the longer this goes, the more dangerous it is. Now, what is done to ensure the safety is a good question, because the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, does not have access to the site. We don't really know what's happening inside. We know that Ukrainian workers who used to run it before the war are still running it, so this is trained personnel, but it's under the control of Russian officials, and the Ukrainians do not have at all times contact to the Ukrainian authorities. So the most urgent thing would now be to grant access for the international experts to this power plant.
Matthias, thank you very much. That was our correspondent Matthias Böllinger there in Kiev. Russia has consistently denied that it's targeting civilian infrastructure in its war against Ukraine, but the destruction on the ground suggests otherwise. According to the Ukrainian government, hundreds of health facilities have been damaged. DW's Birgitta Schulke went to the northern town of Chernihiv, where she met a man who's trying to hold Russia accountable.
As Deputy Health Minister, Pavlo Kovtoniuk worked for years to rebuild Ukraine's healthcare system. In his new job, he documents its destruction. This used to be the Chernihiv Cardiac Center until it was totally destroyed by a Russian airstrike. That strike is one of more than 180 hospital attacks Kovtoniuk and his team have documented.
I see the systemic pattern of destruction of healthcare as a part of civilian livelihood, because it's not only about healthcare, it's all types of civilian objects are being systemically targeted.
A dashcam video caught the moment when 8 Russian bombs hit the residential area, leaving a crater right next to the cardiac center. The attack killed 47 people that day. The city was under constant shelling, a resident tells us.
Excavators had to dig the graves. There were so many victims that they had to bury them in body bags.
Pavlo Kovtonyuk and his small NGO collect witness accounts, photos of damage and remnants of weapons. They hope the evidence can be used in future litigation. They just work on cases where no Ukrainian military were based nearby. Only then, Kovtonyuk says, could such an attack amount to a war crime. Attacks on health facilities like this one leave much more destruction than a wrecked hospital. They leave people without immediate and long-term health care. And they add to fear and insecurity because hospitals are no longer a place of safety. Doctors at the Chernihiv Children's Hospital just across the street treated the injured of the cardiac center attack. A day Dr. Mikola Lutkevich says he will never forget.
We're trained trauma surgeons, but we never ever experienced this kind of bleeding wounds. Everybody was screaming, adults and kids. We put 5 of them here on the floor, but more and more were coming. It was chaos.
During the constant shelling, the doctors did everything they could to keep their young patients safe. And that meant a lot of time in the basement. 2 weeks later, a bomb hit here.
It was a cluster bomb. The ammunition parts were everywhere. Fortunately, there had been an air raid alarm before the cluster attack, so the children were in the basement. If not, we could have had 237 deaths.
He shows Kovtonyuk the shrapnel he collected from the site. They operated for hours, he says, to get dozens of similar pieces of shrapnel out of the children's bodies.
So when you hear this, it's no need to explain why we need justice, because somebody needs to pay for what was done to people like Mykola or his patients.
On the way out of Chernihiv, we pass another destroyed hospital. It may take years before an international court or tribunal starts dispensing justice. But when they need his evidence, Kovtonyuk says it's ready and waiting.